My husband kicked me out while I was in labor, believing I was penniless and dependent. He had no idea I secretly inherited a $10 million fortune. And the new wife he flaunts just started working directly under me. Their shocking reality is about to unravel. My name is Gabriella Miller, and I'm 45 years old. 19 years ago, I was a girl from the suburbs of Iowa, bringing simple dreams into a marriage with the man I thought was the love of my life, Mason. He was 2 years older than me, a former college classmate who always knew how to make me laugh and feel loved, at least for the first few years. Back then, I just had a bachelor's degree in education and a heart full of hope. We moved to a small town in Oregon, where Mason got a job at a construction company, and I became a full-time homemaker. It wasn't because I didn't want to work. Mason once held my hand and said, "I want you to stay home and take care of our home. I'll handle the rest." I believed him. I believed him enough to give up a teaching opportunity I'd dreamed of since I was 15. Just to build a family life I thought would make me happy. In the early years, Mason was a wonderful husband. He brought home flowers every weekend, often hugged me from behind while I was cooking, and whispered sweet things like, "I'm so lucky to have you." I clearly remember those autumn afternoons when we picked apples in the backyard, laughing and playing like two kids. But then, somehow, Mason's smile began to fade. He started coming home late, talked less, and the tenderness in his eyes disappeared. I used to tell myself it was just work stress. But after 5 years, that change didn't feel temporary. It became a part of who he was. I remember once, dinner was late because the oven broke. Mason slammed his keys on the table and said coldly, "You can't even cook dinner. What do you do all day?" I stood frozen in the kitchen, still holding the burnt cake spatula. That sentence felt like a blow to the dignity I had clung to for years. From then on, the sarcasm and disdainful looks became routine. He stopped asking if I was tired, stopped caring about the meals I worked hard to prepare. Mason began comparing me to other women, his beautiful, successful co-workers. "Why don't you learn something from other wives?" he once said during an argument when I simply asked him to come home earlier for dinner. We never had children. I used to think it was a regret, but over time, I began to see it as a blessing. I didn't want a child growing up in a home where love had been reduced to scraps. Every morning, I woke up early to make breakfast, do laundry, and clean every corner of the house. A 3-bedroom home, Mason said, was too big for a woman who doesn't earn a dime. I didn't respond. I had learned to stay silent because every time I spoke up, all I got was a cold stare and suffocating indifference. I used to think if I tried hard enough, he would become the man he used to be. But the harder I tried, the smaller I felt in the very home I worked so hard to build. I lived like a shadow in our marriage, always asking myself where I went wrong. Was it because I didn't make money, or because I was no longer the young woman he married? Then one day, while I was scrubbing the floors, Mason walked past me without a glance and muttered, "If you can't do anything else, at least clean the floor properly." I gripped the mop handle tightly, my chest tightening. I didn't cry. I didn't react, but something in me shifted. A tiny seed of awareness began to grow, and I knew one day that seed would grow into a decision Mason would never see coming. After that moment, I began observing him more closely. I stopped quietly enduring. Instead of worrying about pleasing a man who had become distant, I silently took note of every little sign: the way he smiled at his phone, the nights he claimed he had to work late but came home smelling of unfamiliar cologne, and the unexplained charges on our bank statements. Mason used to be ambitious, at least in the early years. He worked for a small construction company in Eugene, Oregon, where we lived, and often bragged about becoming a manager within a few years. But that promise stayed a promise. After 5 years, Mason quit because he didn't fit the company culture. Then, a year later, he quit again because his boss was too old-fashioned. Eventually, I stopped asking why. Every time he came home with that cold expression and the words, "I quit," I just pressed my lips together and quietly adjusted the household budget. There was a time we had to sell our old car to pay off credit card debt. I started cutting back on meals, replacing steak with lentil soup and toast, trying to make sure Mason didn't feel the pressure. I even tutored neighborhood kids in the evenings to make a little extra money, but it was never enough to cover the months he was out of work. He never asked if I was tired, never knew that I sometimes slept on the sofa because I didn't have the strength to climb the stairs. Then last summer, Mason got a new job at a local real estate firm. The salary wasn't high, but he could earn commission if he made sales. He seemed different, dressed sharper, started wearing cologne he once called unnecessary. He even bought an expensive watch and said it was to impress clients. I didn't question it because deep down, I still had hope. Hope that this was his chance to grow up and finally value our marriage. But instead of coming home for dinner, Mason started disappearing more often. Some nights he said he had to meet a client at 8 p.m. Other times it was a networking event. I quietly made my own plate, sat by the window looking out at the empty street, listening to the ticking clock, counting down the days of a crumbling marriage. One night, while arranging flowers in the living room, one of the few things that brought me peace, Mason came home late, looking excited. As he took off his shoes, he said, "I closed a deal with a potential client named Ava. She's a big investor, probably coming back." When I asked, "Who's Ava?" Mason just waved it off. "Just a client. Don't overthink it." But I couldn't stop thinking, because that night, while picking up the clothes Mason left on the chair, I found a receipt from a fancy downtown restaurant, a place we had never gone together because it was too expensive. I started looking into things, not in dramatic, movie-like ways, but with the quiet patience of someone who had grown used to listening in silence. I tracked receipts, his absences, even the moment he changed his phone password without telling me. I didn't tell anyone, not even my sister in Seattle. I felt ashamed, as if the cracks in my marriage were entirely my fault. One night, I woke up and heard Mason chuckling softly while texting. The glow from his screen lit up his face, a face that no longer looked like the man I once loved, but a stranger, cold, secretive, living a life I was no longer part of. I wondered if men, when they fall short of success, try to cling to something else to feel important again. When Mason was no longer the provider, did he need to be desirable to someone else to feel worthy? Whatever the reason, I was too exhausted to keep making excuses for him. Love should not make someone feel small every single day. That night, I opened the drawer and took out a folder I had prepared long ago. Something Mason never knew about. I looked at the printed pages, my heart heavy but no longer trembling like before. The divorce papers were still blank, undated. But I knew that the moment I picked up the pen to sign them would be the moment I chose myself again. I tucked the folder into the secret pocket of my handbag, where Mason never looked. To others, it might have just been a few meaningless pages, but to me, they were a shield. The one thing that made me feel like I still had some control in a life that had grown so unfamiliar. I hadn't signed yet, nor did I plan to file them just yet. But knowing I could at any time helped me sleep through those long nights. Mason didn't come home. I thought my life would continue, in that haze of doubt and waiting, until a phone call from my mother changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had just brewed a pot of tea when the phone rang. The screen showed Mom, just like always. Her voice came through the speaker, still warm as ever, but today it held something else: excitement, a hint of emotion. "Gabby," she called me by my childhood nickname. "Do you remember the forest property up north that Grandma left behind?" I paused. "Yes, I remember. The one with the old wooden cabin." "Right, that's right," my mother replied, then hesitated. "She transferred the deed to you when you were 30. She did it because she believed you were the only one in the family who truly valued what matters." I sank into the chair, heart pounding. I remembered those childhood summers there, the sound of birds in the trees, the scent of wild grass, and Grandma's cornbread, but I never thought it would become something this important. My mom continued, her voice lower now. "Last week, I hired someone to appraise the entire property, the lakeside part and the mountain edge. Gabby, you won't believe it. The land is now worth nearly $7 million. My mouth dropped. "You said how much? $7 million? Maybe more if you sell during peak season. And if you count the little house in the city Grandma bought under your name. When you graduated, you've got almost $9 million in real estate." I sat there, still holding the teapot that was growing cold, my mind swirling. Mason didn't know about this. I had forgotten about it myself. I never thought I'd need it. I had loved Mason so much, I was willing to erase my own worth just to keep him. My mom gently added, "I don't trust Mason. I never have. But I trust you. And you should know everything is in your name. No one can touch it unless you allow it." I thanked her, then sat quietly long after the call ended. Her words echoed in my mind like a wake-up bell. I had lived all these years thinking I had nothing, no career, no value, no future. But it turns out, I had everything. And I had simply forgotten myself. That night, when Mason got home, he tossed his blazer on the chair and said casually, "I'm going on a business trip to Bend for 2 days. Don't call. I might not pick up." I just nodded, hiding a faint smile behind my half-finished cup of tea. It had been a long time since I felt this calm. Looking at Mason, I no longer trembled when he acted irritated, no longer felt empty when he left without a kind word. After he went upstairs, I opened my laptop and began researching Oregon divorce laws, asset valuations, and top attorneys in the area. I wasn't going to tell Mason just yet, but step by step, I had started preparing. I also called an old friend, Amelia, a family law attorney I went to college with. We hadn't stayed in close touch, but she had always been genuine. After listening to everything, Amelia paused for a moment, then said softly, "Gabby, if you need someone to represent you, I'm here. And don't feel guilty for protecting yourself." I thanked her, gently closed the laptop. Outside the window, a light rain had started. The drops tapped against the glass like the rhythm of a new hope. I knew Mason still believed I could never leave him, that I'd always be the woman who depended on her husband. But he didn't know that now I had everything I needed to start over: an untouched fortune, a will that had returned stronger than ever, and a plan that was slowly coming to life. That morning, the Oregon sky was gray, as if foreshadowing something ominous. I got up earlier than usual to go to the farmer's market, the one thing each week that gave me a sense of freedom, even if it was just picking out a few bunches of greens or fresh apples. But perhaps fate had been waiting for me at the last turn on Riverview Road. The truck in front of me suddenly slammed on its brakes. I instinctively swerved right but couldn't make it in time. The sound of metal crashing rang out sharply, and everything around me turned upside down. I don't remember much after that, only that I woke up under cold white lights, surrounded by the sharp scent of antiseptics in a hospital room. "I'm Dr. Rena," said a calm-voiced, middle-aged man, as I slowly opened my eyes. "Miss Gabriella, you have fractured ribs and a neck sprain. Fortunately, there's no brain trauma, but you'll need to stay in the hospital for at least a week for observation." I tried to nod, but the pain in my neck was so sharp I couldn't move. The only thing I could feel was emptiness and loneliness. Mason didn't show up that day, didn't even call. I lay still in bed, listening to the sounds of carts rolling, nurses speaking over intercoms, and waited. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for: a check-in, a text, or at the very least, some sign that he still thought of me. It wasn't until the second day that Mason finally showed up. But he wasn't alone. I heard the sound of high heels clicking steadily down the hallway before the door opened. Mason walked in looking completely unfazed, as if he were stopping by to visit an acquaintance. The woman beside him, around 30 tall, with softly curled blonde hair and a tight-fitting blue dress, flashed a radiant smile when she saw me. "Gabriella," Mason said without hesitation, "we need to talk." I turned my head toward him with difficulty, trying to stay calm even as my stomach churned. The woman didn't wait to be invited. She walked up beside my bed, completely at ease, as if she belonged there. "I'm Tessa," she said, her voice light as air but full of smugness. "I'm sure Mason's mentioned me." I looked at Mason. He didn't deny it, didn't step back, didn't apologize. "Tessa and we're together now," Mason said slowly, as if explaining something obvious. "This will be best for all three of us. You don't need to worry. Tessa will take care of me." I let out a dry, broken laugh. "Did you just say best for me?" Mason sighed, as if I was the one making things difficult. "You should let go. I think we should get a divorce. You know, we haven't had anything for a long time." Tessa stepped back, folded her arms, her eyes gliding over my 4 lines, like she was evaluating something ready to be discarded. I didn't say a word. Instead, I reached, slightly trembling but firm, for the bedside drawer and took out a thin beige folder. Inside was a printed divorce form with both our full names, just missing the date and signatures. I placed it on the side table and looked him straight in the eye. "I've had this ready for a while, Mason. I was just waiting for a clear reason." He froze for a moment. His expression wavered, but then it returned to his usual smugness. "Good, I'll sign it." Tessa smiled faintly. "Looks like you're reasonable after all." I didn't respond. Inside, I no longer felt the pain I used to during those early days of his coldness. What I felt now was something oddly peaceful, like I had finally let go of a silent burden that had worn me down for nearly 2 decades. Before they left the room, Mason turned back and said, as if it were an obligatory line. I hope you'll be okay, even without me. I smiled slightly. No bitterness, no resentment, just the kind of smile someone wears when they know they're about to reclaim their freedom. As the door closed behind them, I closed my eyes. One chapter had ended, and I knew the next one was about to begin. Not just with the divorce, but with a truth Mason had no idea about. I was never as empty-handed as he believed. I was discharged on a Monday morning, when dough still clung to the grass and the April wind rustled the branches outside the hospital. The first thing I saw when I turned on my phone was a message from Amelia, my lawyer. She had messaged the day before, "Mason just filed for divorce, but don't worry, I handled it exactly as planned." I smiled, a rare one, after so many suffocating months. A week before the accident, Amelia and I had quietly filed a motion to reject any unilateral divorce filing at the county court. It was a precaution in case Mason tried to run off without having to split assets. At the time, I wasn't sure if I'd need it, but now it turns out my instincts had never been wrong. At 3 p.m., my phone wouldn't stop ringing. I saw the caller ID, Mason, and waited until the fifth call to answer. "Gabby, where are you? Why was the divorce filing denied?" he barked. Not a single word of concern, not even a question about my health after getting out of the hospital. I held the phone slightly away from my ear, as if his tension might seep through the screen. "Oh, that," I replied calmly. "You must have forgotten. Every time we argued in the past, you always threatened divorce. I just wanted to make sure that if you ever actually filed, I'd be ready." "Ready for what? Are you kidding me?" Mason nearly shouted. I kept my tone steady on purpose. "I think it's best we work through our lawyers. Joint assets, separate property division. Just follow the law." There was silence on the other end. Then Mason spoke again, his voice no longer harsh but tinged with underlying worry. "Gabby, what assets? You don't have anything to split." I laughed, not from amusement, but because I knew exactly the man behind the voice still believed I was just a penniless housewife with no career and no power. "Nothing," I said slowly. "Mason, I think you should speak to my attorney, because there's a lot you don't know yet." I heard a chair scrape, followed by a long, tense sigh on his end. "Don't make this complicated, Gabriella," Mason said, switching to a more persuasive tone. "I just want to get this over with so I can move on." "With Tessa?" I asked, not bothering to hide the sarcasm. He didn't answer. I continued, "If you're in such a rush, that's too bad. Because until the asset division is resolved, your divorce filing won't go through. And I heard Oregon requires all financial matters to be settled before a remarriage can be registered, right?" A heavy breath came through the line. I knew he was more desperate than ever. He didn't just want to end things with me. He wanted to lock things down with Tessa, the woman he believed would give him an easier life. But what he didn't expect was that I'm not the Gabriella he used to know. "I'll talk to your lawyer," Mason said quickly, as if trying to end the call. "One more thing," I cut in before he could hang up. "You should know I currently own over $8 million in real estate and inherited assets in my name alone. And under the law, any separate property acquired before marriage or gifted directly isn't subject to division. But if you want to fight it, be my guest." The call ended in silence, a silence as heavy as stone. I stood by the window of the small apartment I was temporarily renting after being discharged, eyes closed, savoring the feeling of newfound freedom. For the first time in 19 years, I wasn't afraid of anything, not of being left behind, not of being judged, and especially not of a man who had underestimated my worth. That evening, Amelia sent me a detailed plan: what assets to list, which documents to prepare, which legal steps to take first. "We're going to throw him off so hard he won't know what hit him," she messaged, adding a cheeky smiley face. I looked at the screen and smiled. I didn't need revenge born of anger. I only needed the truth. And the truth is, the man who once looked down on me is now racing against the weight of his own mistakes. Mason may have thought he won when he left me in the hospital to chase a new love. The next morning, my phone started ringing nonstop at 8 a.m. I knew instantly it was Mason. He called 12 times before switching to a rapid stream of texts, each just seconds apart. "Did you lock the account? I can't withdraw money. What did you do with my card? Gabriella, answer me." I let out a long breath. Every word flashing on the screen only made me more certain. I was right to notify the bank to freeze withdrawals from our joint account while I was in the hospital. Before I was discharged, I'd requested to fully separate the accounts and cancel his secondary card. Mason wasn't notified because everything was under my name. At the time, it felt like a precaution, but now his reaction proved he didn't just want out of the marriage, he wanted to take what didn't belong to him. The doorbell rang at 10 a.m. I opened the door and almost choked up at the sight of the woman standing in front of me. "God, Gabby, you look so thin," she said, then wrapped me in a hug. "Ollie," I stepped back in disbelief. "You really flew in from Denver." Allison, my best friend from college, who I once thought of as a sister, stepped into the apartment with a gift bag and that familiar magnolia perfume. We had roomed together in the dorms and stayed in touch for over 20 years, even after moving 2 different places. When she heard about my accident, Allie immediately took 3 days off work and flew in. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked as I poured us tea. I nodded, then exhaled. "Better than ever. But there's something you should know." I told Ally everything about Mason, Tessa, the divorce papers, and the assets Mason had no idea existed. She listened intently, never interrupting, only nodding occasionally. When I got to the part about Mason trying to withdraw money from my personal account and getting upset when he couldn't, Ally slammed her teacup down. "That's why you need a lawyer," she said, her tone sharp. "Mason's not just ungrateful, he's greedy." "But wait," I frowned. "Tessa, what about her?" "Tessa Donnelly, yes, why?" Ally narrowed her eyes and pulled out her phone. After a few taps, she showed me a picture. It was a family gathering with Tessa standing beside an older woman I didn't recognize. "That's Tessa's aunt," Ally said. "I know her from a women's real estate investment group in Denver. She used to complain about her niece, spends money like crazy, always dating older men to get ahead in life." I sat upright. "Are you saying Tessa targeted Mason because she thought he was rich?" "Absolutely, and I remember her aunt saying, that girl once faked a pregnancy to trap a doctor into marrying her. Didn't work, but shame was never her thing." I was speechless. Suddenly, all the puzzle pieces connected in my mind. Mason's frequent absences for client meetings, the luxury restaurant receipts, and his unusual urgency to finalize the divorce. I tapped the table lightly. "Do you still have contact with Tessa's aunt?" "Yes." "What are you planning?" I looked at ally.com but resolute. "Start gathering evidence. If Mason thinks he can secretly funnel money to Tessa, or hide the fact that she lied about a pregnancy, then he clearly doesn't know who he's dealing with." That very afternoon, Allie and I met with my lawyer, Amelia. After hearing the story, Amelia smirked slightly. "If what Ally says checks out, we can expand this case to include financial abuse and fraud. Tessa's not walking away clean." Ally added, "I can schedule a meeting with Tessa's aunt this week. I think she'll cooperate if she knows her niece is about to ruin another person's life." I nodded. "Good. I don't want this to drag on, but I'm not walking into any traps either." That night, I received a text from Mason. "Tessa might be in some trouble. Can you withdraw the filing?" "We can. Talk it over like adults." I looked at the message, not even tempted to reply. There was no regret left in me, only clarity. The game Mason and Tessa started was no longer in their hands. The meeting took place on a Friday morning at a private restaurant on the top floor of a boutique hotel in Portland. I had asked Amelia to choose the location for its privacy and formal atmosphere, the kind of setting I knew would keep Mason and Tessa from acting out. When I entered the private meeting room, they were all ready, seated across from each other at a long oak table. Tessa was just as made up as ever, but there was a flicker of worry in her eyes this time. Mason avoided looking at me, nervously fiddling with his water glass. Amelia sat next to me, laid down her briefcase, and looked directly at them. "Thank you for coming. Today we're here to discuss the terms of the asset division and issues arising from the divorce process between my client, Gabriella Miller, and Mr. Mason Miller." Tessa scoffed and leaned toward Mason, whispering, "I thought you said this would be easy." I tilted my head and offered a polite smile. "It will be easy. We're starting with the truth." As soon as I finished speaking, the door opened again. I walked in, carrying a large envelope, followed by a familiar older woman, Mrs. Marianne Donnelly, Tessa's aunt. Tessa immediately jumped up, her voice panicked. "Aunt, what are you doing here?" Mrs. Marianne took a seat on my side of the table, placing the envelope down. "You know exactly what you've done. But if you're going to turn someone else's life into your personal profit scheme, I can't stay silent anymore." I nodded in gratitude. then signaled Amelia. She opened the envelope and pulled out a series of high-resolution photos. Tessa entering a hotel hand in hand with another man, not Mason. Some pictures were in daylight, others at midnight. Additional photos showed Tessa at a bar, cozying up to a group of sharply dressed men, laughing and flirting. Mason visibly paled. He turned to Tessa, eyes wide. "Tessa, what is this?" Tessa stepped back, her voice trembling. "They're just friends." "Friends," Ally cut in. "In 1 week where she claimed to be on business, I counted at least 3 dates, with 3 different men. And according to her aunt, this isn't the first time Tessa's pulled something like this." Amelia presented another document. A statement from Mrs. Marianne confirming that Tessa had once tried to trap a doctor into marriage by faking a pregnancy. I crossed my arms and looked straight at Mason. "And you still planned to marry her? That was fast, considering you're not even divorced yet." Mason clenched his fists and said nothing. Tessa looked like she could barely stand, her eyes darting between me, Ally, and her aunt. Finally, she collapsed into her chair, mumbling, "I'm sorry, I'm not pregnant. I needed someone who could take care of me. I'm tired of struggling. I didn't want to work my whole life just to barely get by." "You plan to live by deceiving others?" Amelia asked, sarcasm dripping from her voice. "No, it's just, I thought Mason had money. I thought he'd give me an easier life." Mason looked at Tessa with a disgust I'd never seen before. Maybe for the first time, he realized he had walked right into a glittering trap. "Regarding the assets," Amelia said, steering the conversation back, "my client has prepared full documentation, proving that the inherited properties, both before and during the marriage, are in her name and not subject to division. However, per Oregon law, any joint contributions during the marriage will be reviewed in court. We're willing to work with the other party if they act in good faith." I added calmly, "But if there's continued avoidance, misuse of joint accounts, or any attempt to conspire for asset theft, I'll have no choice but to pursue both civil and criminal investigations." The room fell silent for a few moments. Then, Mason lowered his head for the first time in all of this. I'll sign everything. I'm sorry, Gabby. I was wrong." I didn't respond, because at this point, apologies meant nothing. What I needed was a clean, transparent ending and a new beginning where I took the lead. Tessa was escorted out by her aunt. Mason signed each document like a machine. When the meeting ended, Amelia leaned toward me and said softly, "Game over, Gabriella. Now it's time to begin again." A week after that fateful meeting, Mason showed up at the door of my temporary apartment, unannounced. No phone call. He stood there in a wrinkled suit, hair unkempt, eyes sunken from lack of sleep. In his hand was a bouquet of yellow tulips, the kind I used to like 15 years ago when we were still dating. "Gabby," he began, his voice raspy, "I've done a lot of thinking. I know I was wrong. Tessa. She used me, but you were always there for me, always good to me. Can we start over?" I stayed silent, not stepping past the doorway. "Things could go back to the way they were," Mason continued. "I realize I can't live without you." I looked at him for the first time with no love, no pain, just complete clarity. "Back to the way they were," I repeated with a small laugh. "You mean the days I was hunched over the stove while you were out to dinner with another woman, or the nights I slept alone, while you were texting someone else?" "It wasn't like that," Mason said quickly. "I was misled. She lied to me about everything." I nodded. "And now you expect me to save you from the consequences you created." I stepped back and closed the door between us, leaving only a narrow crack. "You forgot one thing, Mason. I'm not your past anymore. I'm Gabriella Miller, the woman with nearly $9 million in personal assets, a top legal team, and a life that's starting fresh, without you." I gently closed the door, not a single tear. News of our divorce quickly spread in the local real estate circle, not because of me, but because of Mason. An employee at his firm leaked photos of documents showing he had used the company's account to pay for dates with Tessa. The company launched an internal investigation. Within 3 days, Mason was fired for ethics violations. Without steady income, he was forced to move out of his upscale apartment and back in with his parents in Spokane. But once his family found out he was facing a civil suit and owed me a large settlement for fraudulent behavior, they declared they could no longer support him. They even sent a separate attorney to request removal of their names from a prior loan guarantee. And Tessa. After that confrontation, her aunt contacted her mother, a retired elementary school teacher, and told her everything. A week later, Tessa was pulled out of college, had all her credit cards cut, and was made to work at the family bakery in Idaho. According to Allie, Tessa now wakes up at 4 a.m. every day to knead dough and deliver pastries. Every dollar she earns is withheld to repay the court-awarded settlement. I didn't feel joy from that outcome, nor did I gloat. I just knew that in the end, justice didn't need to be loud to be real. Amelia called me Thursday afternoon to let me know all legal proceedings were finalized. Mason had signed the agreement to divide all joint assets heavily in my favor and had withdrawn all counterclaims. I was officially free, legally and emotionally. That evening, I sat alone on the balcony of my apartment, glass of wine in hand, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. There was no one speaking beside me, no dinner to rush, no footsteps returning home heavy with tension, just me and peace. I thought about the years that had passed. The skipped meals to pay bills, the sleepless nights waiting for Mason to come home, the condescending looks because I was just a housewife. Now all of that belonged to the past. I had finally done something I once thought impossible, let go of the person who hurt me and held on to the one who never left myself. And that was the most valuable thing my marriage ever gave me. 2 months after the divorce was finalized, I left Portland. Not because I wanted to run from old memories, but because I wanted to begin a completely new chapter in a place with no trace of Mason, no rooms that had witnessed my tears, and no more cracked silence between two people who used to call each other husband and wife. I chose Crescent Lake, a small town tucked between pine forests and Oregon's deep green mountains, not too far from the city, but quiet enough to hear birdsong every morning and the breeze drifting through the porch rafters in the afternoon. With a portion of the assets I kept, I bought a 2-story wooden house nestled behind maple trees, with a wide porch and large windows that welcomed the sunlight. Ally was the first to move in with me. We didn't live like a couple, but like two women who had weathered storms and finally found each other in a calm place. Allie had just left a 10-year relationship she described as so peaceful it became dull. She told me, "I don't know exactly what I want, but I know one thing for sure. I don't want to keep living like I'm waiting for someone else to show up and make me feel whole." We shared the housework. I cooked, Ally cleaned, I tended the garden. She picked music and played it every morning. On sunny days, we biked to the farmer's market to buy fresh flowers, fruit, and handmade bread from a sweet elderly woman named Marge, who always smiled and winked, saying, "You two are exactly the kind of independent women I admire." We made it a point to travel at the end of each month. Sometimes just a short trip to Florence Beach, other times a relaxing night at a hot spring cabin. No tight schedules, no one to report to, and certainly no sighs from someone who didn't value us. I started cooking again, but this time not to please anyone. I experimented with dishes I'd always wanted to try but had been told were too fancy or too expensive. Ally would often stand behind me with a glass of wine in hand, watching like I was putting on a private show. One time she laughed and said, "I've never seen anyone fry fish while wearing a floral dress and pearl earrings like you do." I winked. "I'm not frying fish, I'm creating art." Over time, I realized something important. Freedom isn't about how much money you have, it's about living the way you want without needing permission. Every morning when I opened my eyes, I knew I could choose what to wear, what to eat, what to do, and most importantly, who to live for. And that person, first and foremost, had to be me. One evening, we sat on the porch under blankets, sipping cinnamon tea as the early autumn breeze played with our hair. Ally rested her head on my shoulder and asked, "Do you think if Mason hadn't changed 5 years ago, you'd be living like this now?" I was quiet for a moment, then answered softly, "Probably not. I might still be cooking dinner every night, but in the kitchen of a cold house. I might still be smiling, but it would be the kind of smile that hides the feeling of being forgotten." Ally took my hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Then maybe losing something is the best way to find yourself." I nodded. I used to fear being alone, used to think that without a man beside me, a woman somehow lacked value. But it turns out, it was in the quiet moments by myself that I heard my inner voice the clearest. We decided to plant a flower garden in the backyard and build a wooden bookshelf for the little reading room by the window. I also began writing a blog, sharing recipes and my journey of starting over, not for fame, but to tell other women that it's never too late to change course. One October afternoon, with sunlight streaming through the pine trees and painting everything in soft gold, I sat at my desk writing the final lines of a blog post titled, "Alone but Not Lonely." I looked up and out the window where Allie was, watering lavender. She turned, lifted her arm to wave at me, her smile as bright as the sunshine, and in that moment, I knew I had truly found home. Not a location, but a feeling, peace, wholeness, and being completely myself. From my own story, I realized that freedom and happiness don't come from holding on to a person or a marriage that's already crumbled, but from having the courage to walk away, even if it means walking alone. I once believed that being a devoted wife was enough. But the truth is, a woman's worth doesn't lie in sacrifice, it lies in self-respect and the ability to take charge of her own life. Now, I live lighter than ever, needing no one's permission to simply be me. What do you think of Gabriella's journey? Have you experienced something similar? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to follow the channel for more meaningful stories about life and family relationships.